Okay, thank you very much for coming to this international symposium on loneliness and the social isolation at work, scientific approach to solutions. We have more than 100 people pre-registered to the conference, but probably people are coming slower. So I hope more people will be in this conference later on. But let me start the opening remarks. I'm Norito KAWAKAMI, the project professor of Digital Mental Health Graduate School of Medicine at the University of Tokyo. And on behalf of the organizing team, I'd like to express a warm welcome to all of you. In a contemporary society, and particularly during the global pandemic, loneliness and social isolation have received attention as a public health issues. Loneliness is a subjective, distressing, unpleasant experience that results from the discrepancy or unmet need between the individual expectation and also the actual experience. Research has shown that loneliness is quite common, and it's influenced not only by personal factors, but also by the social and the environmental factors. Researchers argue that loneliness is not just a symptom of mental health problem, but rather a unique, independent construct. Some researchers propose that loneliness has a biological basis in our brain, and it's a built-in warming sign to encourage people to reconnect with others. However, the chronic loneliness is sometimes difficult to overcome and can have adverse impact on people's health and well-being. On the other hand, loneliness at work is a domain-specific aspect of loneliness, general loneliness, that affect also the people's work health and daily life. Recent population-based studies have found that the certain population of workers suffer from the loneliness at the workplace. However, research on loneliness at work is less extensive than research on the general loneliness. So limited research have been conducted on the prevalence, risk factors, consequences, psychological and biological mechanisms, and also interventions to prevent and improve loneliness at work. So we hope that this international symposium will be the first opportunity to discuss the current state of research and on the loneliness and the social isolation at work and potential interventions. It is very honored that today we received a message from our government to this symposium. The message is on the pink card seat. The letter is from the Mr. Hidenori Narimatsu, Director General Officer for the Advanced Measures to Address Loneliness and Isolation, the Japan Cabinet Office, which is a headquarters for addressing the loneliness and isolation in Japan. Briefly, message tells us first, building on the act on the advancement of measures to address the loneliness and isolation that's enacted last year, the government of Japan has prioritized the prevention of loneliness and isolation by fostering the everyday social connections. And second, in February this year, a project team was launched to promote social connections, particularly for the single-person household and, more importantly, the working generations. In its July report has now emphasized that the critical role of private enterprises, companies, in preventing the loneliness at work. So there are two expressions for private companies. First, to support employees in building the community ties and local places of belongings, which they are still in the workforce. so that they do not fall into the loneliness after their retirement. And the second thing is, as employers, to promote the connections among the people working from their perspective of safeguarding their mental health and physical well-being. So this is a message quite, encouraging. The message continues to tell us that they expect the symposium to summarize the current knowledge about the loneliness at the workplace and give some feedback to the government so that the government can do more about this part. Okay, so we will do our best today to meet the expectation and hoping that our symposium would contribute to the prevention of loneliness in this society. Oh, thank you very much. This is the opening remarks now over. And we will begin the main program shortly. I hope you enjoy the whole day international program. Thank you very much. The first program of this international conference is a keynote speech by Professor WRIGHT. It's my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor WRIGHT from the University of Canterbury. And Professor WRIGHT is a professor of the management, marketing, and tourism, and also associate dean for research at UC Business School, University of Canterbury, New Zealand. She took her PhD in psychology 2005, and then she worked as a faculty member for current department for 20 years. Professor WRIGHT is an internationally recognized scholar whose research has shed vital light on the complex issue of loneliness in the workplace. She started her work on loneliness at work in her PhD thesis, and she developed the most widely used scale of loneliness at work. Her work further explores how organizational culture, leadership, and everyday interactions shape the social connection. That's why it's so essential to employee well-being and productivity. So this year, also she published the short article on loneliness at work in the Harvard Business Review. Today, she will share with us her latest perspectives on loneliness at work and pathways towards meaningful solutions. Okay, so please join me in warmly welcoming Professor WRIGHT.
Thank you very much, Sensei. It's my honor to be here today, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you in sharing with you my reflections on loneliness at work research. And thank you for coming, and thank you very much for hosting me. I very much appreciate it. So my area of research is on loneliness. I have been doing research in this area for a number of years, and I focus predominantly on loneliness, but I've also in recent years started to focus on social connection as well. So not just about what creates loneliness, but also what we can do to foster social connection in organizations, particularly post-COVID, when we had many measures that meant that we were more and more physically isolated. But first, I'd like to share with you some of the reasons why I study loneliness, and this is where the reflection comes in about the past 20 years. Because I'm often asked, why do I study loneliness? What is it that made me study it in the first place, and what keeps me studying it for all these years? I have two answers to that question. The first one is academic, and the second one is personal, and I'd like to share with both of them with you today. So academically, I'm interested in studying the paradox, why someone should feel lonely in a socially conducive environment. Why would someone feel isolated when they're surrounded by people? Why would someone have an abundance of social resources yet feel lonely in having those resources and feel alone? Being successful but feeling invalidated in that social environment. So these paradoxes are what drives me to understand loneliness from an academic perspective, and why we might not feel heard and invalidated and not have the opportunity to talk with others in a workplace that is set up to do so. So it was a brief conversation with a CEO in a lift, in an elevator, who disclosed his loneliness to me that sparked a more personal interest in the topic. I was curious that someone so successful could be expressing something so distressing to me about his loneliness and why they should feel lonely. And that curiosity sparked a seed of interest in exploring what loneliness is in an organizational context. And so I left the corporate world where I was working at the time to pursue a PhD in the topic. But why did a conversation about loneliness that lasted less than a minute spark such a curiosity for me and leave such a lasting impression 20 odd years later? It's not a typical response to have a fleeting conversation that probably meant nothing to the CEO but meant a lot to me, and then devote the next couple of decades to studying it. So to answer that question, I need to take you back to 1977 when I was born and why I've ended up here in Japan. So I was born in a small forestry settlement in a town or a village called Kawarau, which is in the Bay of Plenty in New Zealand. My father was a rural school teacher and we moved around a lot. So in my first year of life, I moved 3 times. And by the time I was 18, I had moved 13 times and been to 8 different schooling environments. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with moving and changing schools, and I'm certainly not unique in that experience. I'm sure there's a number of you out there who've had similar experiences. But what moving around taught me is 2 things. One is how to fit in a social environment and fit in fast so you don't feel ostracized or rejected by that social group. And second is how to live life on the periphery of a social network and always looking from the outside in, particularly as an introvert. So effectively, when you move around a lot, you don't necessarily get the benefits of being embedded in a social environment, and you spend a lot of time looking from the outside in. In my last year of high school, the notion of going to university was introduced to me, and it's not something that I had considered before because none of my family had ever been to university. But intuitively, I thought this is a place that I might be able to spend a bit of time. So in 1996, having never stepped foot in a university before, I started an undergraduate degree in psychology with the intention of doing organizational psychology. I went to my first psychology lecture, and the topic was the fight or flight response. It made so much sense to me that of the idea that there was a connection between how we felt and how we behaved. I remember walking through campus feeling for the first time that I could choose to be somewhere and I could choose to belong in this environment, and I could actually settle and perhaps even feel like I belonged here. So I stayed and I finished, and then I went to work for a consulting firm called Accenture, both in the US and New Zealand, and it was the conversation in the elevator that sparked me to go back and to do a PhD. So to answer the question of why I study loneliness, it has personal resonance with me. I struggled to find a sense of belonging in my childhood and adolescence, but I found it at university and in the academic community. I have experienced both ends of the spectrum, the awkwardness of loneliness as a child and a teenager, and the joy and comfort of belonging and how it is the antidote to loneliness. I don't see loneliness as a personal failure, which it's often described as, which is why it's so stigmatized and difficult to talk about, and it's taken 20 years to get to the point that we can talk about it openly. But rather, it's a natural response to our social environment. Because we take the burdens of our childhood into our adult years, my focus was on finding stability, and I found that both at university and through studying loneliness. So in some ways, studying loneliness solved my loneliness. But back in the early 2000s, no one was studying loneliness in an organizational context. The irony was not lost on me that I was the only one working in this area on the topic of loneliness. Early on in my career, I had difficulty publishing because editors and reviewers didn't see loneliness as an organizational problem worth studying. There was no theory, there was no context in which I could ground my research, and all I had was anecdotes or stories from lots of people who would tell me quite openly about the distressing effects that loneliness was having in their work context and the poor relationships that they were experiencing because of it. So now I have laid the foundation for why I study loneliness. I want to take you through a journey of some of the publications that I've worked on to show the journey of where we are today. So my very early publications, you might not be able to see, but they are mostly sole-authored. So I was literally doing this work on my own. My early studies reckoned with the idea that loneliness wasn't purely an individual problem, but part of the property of the organization. And it stemmed right back to the conversation that I had with the CEO, is that it's not a personal problem all by itself. There's something about the social environment in organizational context that might induce loneliness in someone who may not ordinarily feel lonely. So my earliest study showed that a negative climate that fostered competition and lack of social support is the strongest predictor of loneliness in organizations, more so than individual differences, such as introversion. Workplace loneliness, which is what I called it at the time, I now refer to it just as work loneliness, and we'll get to that soon, is linked to negative outcomes like psychological withdrawal and lower organizational commitment. So my very first study showed how much of an context placed on loneliness in organizations and some of the negative outcomes in terms of individual outcomes and it's okay. In terms of some of the negative outcomes. I also created a measure of workplace loneliness, which we will be discussing today, because existing scales didn't take into account the context of a work environment and the nature of the work relationships in an organization. I started to learn more about the actual experience of loneliness at work itself and some of the intrapsychic experiences that people were having, what it was, how it was experienced, and how it was experienced by different levels within the organization, so the difference between managers and non-managers, for example. And so it was really about how that context influenced that experience. Because I was getting reviewer feedback that there was no literature base in which to ground the empirical work that I was doing to support my studies, I decided to co-write a theoretical paper on work loneliness, and it was published in Human Relations along with my co-author, Tony Szilard, who works with leaders and non-profit organizations and taught me how to see loneliness from different organizational contexts. The publication coincided with COVID-19 in early 2020 and the associated lockdowns. All of a sudden, the lonely voices who are known to be out there became a louder chorus. The lockdowns helped us see the problem, if I put that in inverted commas, the problem of loneliness and social disconnection. And thankfully, the benefits that we get from working together in person. And for me, I no longer needed to justify or explain why loneliness was such a problem. The benefits of publishing this paper was that I found new co-authors and many people whom with I could work. And I discovered that there was actually quite a few people interested in the topic. So I wasn't working on the topic on my own anymore. So this is the model that we published in that paper, and I apologize that you probably can't see the detail, but what it effectively means is we defined loneliness as the psychological distress of a gap between what someone wants in their relationships, between what someone has. But that's just a cognitive assessment. You might just feel a little bit dissatisfied with the amount or the quality of relationships you have at work. There might not be any distress involved in that. But once someone makes that assessment that their relationships are deficient in some way, then they have an emotional response. And if that emotional response is negative and distressing, that's what we call loneliness. So it's not just the gap that's important, but it's also that association of the emotion that it is negative and it's distressful in some way. It's interesting also the notion that we could have more relationships than we actually want. And when I first published this paper, I called that relational encroachment, that somehow you had more of what you needed. But the more qualitative research I'm doing in terms of reading and listening to people's loneliness, that relational encroachment is a form of loneliness as well, because they're still not getting what they need. They might have a lot of people in their social world, in their social context, but if no one's listening to them, if they're not feeling heard, if they're invalidated in some ways, that's a form of loneliness as well. So over time, we have developed the idea that loneliness is not just about more relationships, but it's about how someone experiences those relationships. And so for one person might be enough to feel that they're not lonely anymore. So it's muted in their consciousness that feel lonely if they've got that one connection that they want. It might be that someone else needs an abundance of relationships working across multiple teams in an organization to feel that they're truly socially connected. So from the Human Relations article, I then went on to publish several more articles, one of which was on young workers' loneliness, suggesting that younger workers entering the workforce after COVID-19 felt unheard and unseen in organizations and were having an increasingly difficult time fitting into the social fabric of the organization because it was so diffused and fragmented. Another paper was on the precarious work and the experience of loneliness. Being a gig worker or a temporary worker means that you're on the fringe of a social network and it's hard to feel that you belong to the fabric of the organization. Another was on how third places can reduce loneliness for remote workers. So it might not be that someone works from home exclusively or works from the office exclusively, but they find a third place which actually can reduce their loneliness because they find that they work with people that they want to be around on a daily basis rather than forced to be around. So helpfully, in 2023, the Surgeon General in the US published a report that indicated that social connection should become a strategic imperative for organizations across all levels. So right from the top executive level right down to the worker. At the time, there were no current studies on how to resolve work loneliness from a managerial point of view, and what managers could do to help. And these were the questions that we were being frequently asked is, okay, so we know now that loneliness is a problem. We get that, but what is it that we can do to help? So I teamed up with Constance Hadley at the University of Boston, and we did a study on managerial interventions for work loneliness. By this stage, we were starting to see that there was some major health risks associated with loneliness. And I'm sure you're all familiar with these. But from an employee outcome, this is what got the attention that we needed the attention to be at in terms of organizational leaders paying attention. So there's health risks, there's increased daily stress, and that's doesn't necessarily mean that loneliness causes stress. It could be that stress causes loneliness as well. Diminished productivity, lowered quality of output, and the greater likelihood of quitting. And that bottom one we are finding consistently is that there is this, the lonelier the worker is, the more likely they are to withdraw from their social environment and actually leave the workplace. So there is a financial tag that we can place on loneliness at work. So this is the study that we did. We surveyed 1,000 US workers, knowledge workers. We stratified them by loneliness. So we intentionally wanted to find people who were lonely and who were not lonely so we could study the differences. We used a recruitment firm to find these people and pay them. And the first study was mostly quantitative. And the second, we asked participants to audio record their stories. And that was fascinating methodology in itself, is that because loneliness is stigmatized, sometimes doing an interview, an in-person interview, can reduce the honesty of responses or the integrity of the responses. So doing anonymous audio recordings, we got very rich data with stories coming out of organizational factors that contributed to their loneliness that they wouldn't have necessarily told anyone in their work environment and certainly wouldn't have told the organizational powers that be. So how did we measure loneliness? As I said before, in 2006, I came up with a loneliness at work scale. And that scale is still valid. It's still being used, obviously, and particularly with this crowd. But the issue with that is that it places loneliness in the context of a place. And particularly post-COVID, we might not be working in one place anymore. So it was difficult to respond to those items for people that might be hybrid or working remotely. So we made a shorter scale and didn't localize the items, so the items are more generic to the organization that they work for rather than the place in which they work. So questions like, people in my organization understand who I really am, and that was really getting at the qualitative data that we had around people being able to be themselves at work and not having to wear a mask or a facade in doing their work and being at work. I feel lonely while working. We included this item because previous scales haven't used a direct measure using the word lonely because it's so stigmatized. But we felt that the conversation was moving to a place in which we could include it and it wouldn't be as stigmatized, especially if answering anonymously. This one, there are enough people who would have my back if I needed support. This came up time and time again in our stories and our qualitative data about the loneliest people described not having someone to support them, particularly when they were having times of distress or needed extra support. I feel left out by others in my organization, and the opposite, I feel satisfied with my work relationships. So those 5 items were a quick way to assess loneliness. We've since validated it and shown it to be a reliable measure of loneliness, and it also has, again, a strong connection to intention to quit and job satisfaction. So what we found in our study, most recent study, is that organizational culture matters more so than individual differences. And this, 20 years later, this was exactly the same finding that I found in my original study, but we did it in a different way. So what was most stark for us to see is the difference in high lonely versus non-lonely people and the way that they described the organizational culture in which they worked. So, for example, not lonely people worked in environments that were more inclusive, welcoming, and caring. Now, it's not really that surprising that if you work in an environment like that, it's going to be because of the relational behaviors that are expressed in that environment. So you walk into a workplace or even on a virtual environment and you feel welcomed, you feel included because you can be yourself, because someone supports you, you feel satisfied with those relationships. In contrast, those people who work in transactional, biased and hostile environments are more likely to be lonely. And again, it's not surprising from a relational point of view. If you work in a place or an environment that is very focused on transactions, no one's necessarily going to ask you how you are, how you feeling supported in your work environment. So we also asked about social opportunities and what social opportunities were available in their organisation. And we expected to see a big difference in terms of what social opportunities were available and what they would prefer to see in their organisation by different demographic groups. So we thought we would see a difference in preference for social engagements from working parents versus younger workers. And we expected to find tremendous variety, but we were actually wrong. The 3 most common preferred social opportunities in the workplace were all the same across all demographic groups. And they were free communal lunch, meeting chit-chat and happy hour. Now let me explain what these 3 things mean. So because of the way that a lot of people work these days is very fragmented. So having a communal lunch that is sponsored by the organisation sends a signal that those above who are holding the budget care about relationships. And the lunch is purely social. It is not necessarily about productivity or work. It is about, we care about your relationships and we're willing to host this event. Meeting chit-chat is only 5 minutes before a meeting. You have time to ask your colleagues something personal, something about them, what it means to them. And often that's a very good lubricant for work as well, which we often take for granted. And happy hours that are within work time. So again, it's a sponsored event by the organisation. Now, the common aspects that these top 3 social engagements have is that they don't require a lot of time or investment or money. It becomes part of the social fabric that these activities are just built in to the social elements of organisation. And organisations that do these regularly see the benefits of generating strong participation from all their employees, and the investment in relationships can pay off over time. But let's go back. So while we found that consistency and simplicity are more important, it's persistence that helps with inclusion. So, for example, someone may be in the office and there'll be a social engagement and they'll feel too shy or inhibited to come and join in. So it's the responsibility of everyone in that environment to pull that person in and say, come and join us. So they feel welcomed, they feel included. So it's that persistent inclusion which matters. And I'm sure you're aware, one of the interesting aspects about loneliness is that the lonelier someone gets, the more withdrawal they're likely to experience, and it's a vicious cycle. So they feel lonely, they have altered social cognition, and therefore they often withdraw from social opportunities. And that's in an attempt to protect themselves. And so even when social opportunities are available, they may not necessarily be inclined to participate. So feeling of inclusion and feeling welcome is the key to success when it comes to engaging lonely people. because this is what we found also, is that not lonely people, unlonely people, are more inclined to actually engage in these social opportunities compared to highly lonely people. And you see that across all social opportunities available. And this is, my co-author Connie Hadley has done previous research to show that manager inclusiveness is really important when it comes to lowering loneliness. So if the manager is inclusive of everyone, doesn't play favourites, it's really important aspect to loneliness, because we see a direct relationship between how inclusive the manager is and lower loneliness scores. So that's what managers can do to lower loneliness, but what about the managers themselves? So in another study that I've been involved with, a series of studies, is on CEO loneliness, and it's with some colleagues at HEC Montreal, and it's what's called the CEO Hub. And the purpose is to understand the experience of loneliness in the CEO role, particularly not just senior leadership, not executive, but the particular role of being a CEO. And we sampled CEOs in large corporations, and we did 46 in-depth interviews, split by 23 men, 23 women, and we did a separate quantitative study as well. So the findings were really interesting to us because they weren't what we expected. Because we imagined loneliness, this is what the quote from a CEO. We imagine the loneliness of a CEO as a small person alone in a room, perhaps with a potted plant nearby. But that's not the reality. The true loneliness is in the mind. It's there even when surrounded by 50 people. It's the loneliness of the one who ultimately decides, takes responsibility, and bears the weight of risks. So it's not necessarily about being socially isolated or withdrawal. It is about the thoughts and the emotions that the CEO has, that ultimately they're responsible for every decision, and that weight, that burden, creates a sense of isolation because they don't have anyone to turn to. So if you remember back to the measure of loneliness, that one of the aspects of loneliness is that no one has my back. CEOs feel particularly lonely when they feel that no one has their back. No one is there to support them. So it's loneliness. The CEOs are definitely calling this experience loneliness, but it's not as we know it. It's not a relational deficiency. It's a particular type of deficiency in the kind of support that they want. And it's unrelated to the need for belonging. Which is interesting because in all of our other research, loneliness is related to some aspect of belonging. For CEOs, loneliness is a motivator, so they use it as a social signal that their relationships are not right in some way, that they need support in some capacity that they're not experiencing. So we also looked at the triggers of CEO loneliness, and what surfaced the most was organizational vulnerability. So when they perceive that their organization is vulnerable, not necessarily them personally being vulnerable, but the organization is under threat in some way, that's when their loneliness is heightened. So as the CEO said, when everything is fine, everyone is a happy family. But when company performance suffers, that's when you start to feel very lonely as a CEO. So combined with the perception that their top management team isn't providing them with effective support, we also see a sense of loneliness around responsibility, like that. Like I said before, the burden of the decisions is only on their shoulders and theirs alone. It's a loneliness of fortitude, and there's some other research that goes back decades to talk about loneliness in terms of wearing a mask and having to wear a shield. So I can't be me in this environment, and I need to be somebody else. And that's not only exhausting, but it's a very lonely place to be as well. And then loneliness due to the risk of failure. So that threat of failure in the CEO's eyes is very real, and its impacts are felt very strongly, especially regarding their personal branding in terms of who they are as a CEO, but the financial risk as well. So this is some of the future research that I'm working on, or current and future research. So Connie, Hadley and I are currently working on a study about how AI interactions are changing human relationships at work, which is a fascinating study of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer in terms of social relationships. Looking at the impact of AI chatware on work loneliness in terms of how relationships are being substituted in organizations. So we're not necessarily turning to our colleagues when we want help and support, we're turning to a chatbot. Further work on the work loneliness scale, and further work on the CEOs and how they respond to role-related loneliness, so how they cope in those roles, in their role. And currently working on a manuscript with Tony Szilard and Madison Lavella in the US on belongingness signals in organizations. What is interesting to me is I just finished writing a paper that was published on the future of research and loneliness and work loneliness studies. And one obvious gap is interventions, the publication of intervention studies. And that's a real area of need in organizational research. And for example, a recent meta-analysis showed that cognitive behavioral therapies was the best intervention for loneliness, to reduce loneliness. But how does that therapeutic intervention correlate with organizational contexts? How can we translate that research finding into the organizational context? So to finish off, why do I study loneliness? Because it matters, and it matters a great deal, not just in an organizational context, but as we will hear today, in a number of other contexts as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wright, for your outstanding, amazing keynote lecture covering your research in 20 years. That's really great. I think we have some time for the question and answers, if you accept that. So, any questions? Oh, yeah, Josh, please go ahead. Oh, just please wait for the microphone is coming.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I'm just thinking about the workplace as a context for kind of social experiences and loneliness. And there's a couple of things that come to mind about what's different about a workplace. And one is the hierarchy, right? A very formal kind of hierarchy of like kind of getting things done. And that has, a whole, we have hierarchies in families and other places too, but it's a very kind of formal, specific kind of hierarchy. And the other kind of around performance expectations, and then there's a kind of very, people are judged, evaluated very regularly and often harshly, potentially.
Yes.
I just wonder, thinking about those kind of very, the workplace as a context for loneliness, and kind of how you think about those features and how they impact loneliness.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's the reason why I want to study loneliness in the first place, is that those relational dynamics are different in the workplace because of those power dynamics. And primarily, you don't have a choice about who you work with. And that's what was interesting for our study, finding out that third places was where people felt more satisfied. And in that study, I think if I recall the statistics, the majority of people didn't want to work in the office so they could avoid their annoying coworkers. So the workplace provides a unusual context in that we don't have a choice about who to be with, and that can drive loneliness in itself because we're with people who don't get us, who don't understand us, who don't support us. And in some ways that's similar to childhood loneliness in family contexts, but it's very different from an adult who has agency and who can make relationships however they want. So yes, that power dynamic too. Particularly, that's why we study manager loneliness differently from employee loneliness, because they're two groups of people that have different experiences. And to your second point, which remind me...
Evaluation. Being observed and evaluated.
In the work, always being on performance, that's right, yes. So, yes, sometimes people have very grueling performance requirements and performance evaluations, and that can lead to difficulties in social relationships. So I guess it's not that we have performance expectations, but how they're done, which influences a person's perception of their relationships. So we know from other research that if you have high standards and high performance expectations, but it's matched with social support and encouragement and all those good relational benefits, you're likely to feel positive about it. If those high expectations are not met with positive social relational aspects, it's likely to feel like a threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. I can learn many things from your presentation because of your presentation is based on the 20 years experiences. So in your presentation, I am interested in the role of the managers. So now I implement to some kind of organizational interventions as a pilot study in these research groups. So sometimes managers are confused. So because some loneliness, some employees who feeling from the loneliness tend to avoid the meeting, avoid to join the groups. So sometimes managers ask me, what should we do as a manager? So we managers try to include those kind of persons as a force. So because sometimes managers ask one person who's suffering from the loneliness, so they, oh no, I don't want to join this meeting. So at that time, managers are sometimes confused. So some managers ask me, at that time, we should ask them to be to force include, join the meeting. So I would like to know your comment about the role of the managers for toward those kind of loneliness persons.
Yeah, it's a good question because there's a fine line between strong encouragement and being forced. I think I would never recommend forcing social engagement on anyone. I think that strongly encouraging people to participate, if they feel included, they will want to. So, I wouldn't agree with the idea of forcing people. But oftentimes people don't realize the benefits of social engagement until they're in it. And so it's then the forcing might be appropriate, but I would never advocate for forcing. I would advocate for strongly encouraging.
Thank you very much. Sometimes I feel too difficult to answer the question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe one more question? No? I just wonder, in the future research agenda, you listed the AI, artificial intelligence related issue. But what do you think we should study about the AI application? Maybe AI application to reduce loneliness or
we're just doing the analysis at the moment, so it's hot off the press. What we're seeing is that AI can be used for good. It can really help in terms of facilitating more in-person interaction. So say, for example, you have to have a conversation with someone who you might perceive as being, the conversation might be difficult, might be a sensitive topic, you're not sure how to broach it with them, then using AI to help you upskill in terms of how to navigate that conversation can be really helpful. On the other hand, we're finding people who are socially anxious and shy are turning more and more to AI for their companionship needs, which is, we don't know how much of a problem that is yet. It strikes me that it is a problem because it's that vicious cycle getting worse. And one of the potential recommendations is for AI to be a little less frictionless and a little less kind. So encourage people back to human relationships. So have you considered talking to your co-workers about this, or have you considered talking to an expert or a subject matter expert in this?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's enough. Okay, so thank you very, very much again for your wonderful keynote lecture. Please give her a big hand to her. Thank you very much.